When you grow up hearing about Moses, it's easy to take him for granted, as if he's an unquestionable part of human history, the man who stood before Pharaoh, split the Red Sea, and led his people out of slavery, the one who spoke to God on a mountain and came down with tablets that would shape the moral foundation of the world. It's one of those stories that sits so deep in culture that it feels untouchable. But what happens when you actually look for evidence that Moses ever existed, when you step outside the story and ask, where's the proof? Things start to fall apart quickly, because when it comes to Moses, there isn't just a lack of evidence, there's a complete and utter vacuum. Nothing in the archaeological record supports his existence. No Egyptian document, inscription, or monument mentions him. Not a single piece of pottery, carving, or ancient scroll ties to him. For a man supposedly raised in Pharaoh's court, leading hundreds of thousands of people through Egypt and across the desert, the silence from history is deafening. And that's where the story gets interesting. You'd think in a tale this big, plagues, miracles, a nation escaping an empire would leave some kind of trace. Egypt, after all, kept meticulous records. They documented wars, floods, harvests, births, deaths, taxes, does everything. They carved their history into stone. Yet there's not a single Egyptian text that even hints at the mass exodus of Hebrew slaves. You can find records about grain deliveries and temple donations from over 3,000 years ago, but not one mention of the 10 plagues or the drowning of Pharaoh's army. Nothing. This silence isn't just an oversight, it's a fatal contradiction. Because if the story of Moses was real, it would have been one of the most catastrophic events in Egyptian history. The river turning to blood, livestock dying, the death of every firstborn. That's not something anyone would forget or fail to record, especially not a civilization obsessed with documenting the will of the gods. Yet the Egyptians, who wrote about everything from the movement of stars to the price of beer, have no idea who Moses was. So where did he come from? If Moses wasn't real, who invented him, and why? The answer lies in how myths are born. Myths aren't just made up out of nowhere. They evolve, and they're woven from older stories reshaped by culture, politics, and identity. And that's exactly what happened with Moses. His story looks less like a historical biography and more like a stitched-together patchwork of older myths. Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Canaanite, all blended into one convenient hero figure. Take the birth story of Moses. He's said to have been placed in a basket floated down the Nile and discovered by the Pharaoh's daughter. That might sound unique, but it's not. It's almost identical to a much older story. The legend of Sargon of Akkad, a Mesopotamian ruler who lived centuries before the supposed time of Moses. Sargon, too, was said to have been placed in a basket made of reeds, sealed with bitumen, and set adrift on a river, and only to be rescued and raised to greatness. That's not coincidence, that's recycling. Stories like these were often borrowed, reshaped, and localized. Cultures passed myths between them like currency. Egypt and Mesopotamia were the cultural superpowers of their time, and smaller nations often adopted their stories to build their own sense of identity. The Hebrews, emerging as a small tribal people among the Canaanites, needed a grand origin, a story that said, "We are not slaves, we are chosen." And so, over time, an Exodus story was born. It wasn't history, it was a national myth. Archaeologists have searched for any evidence of the Exodus, the supposed journey of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt and wandering 40 years in the desert, but after over a century of excavation, no evidence has surfaced, no remains of camps, no trail of artifacts, no sign of a mass migration. The Sinai desert has been thoroughly studied, and if hundreds of thousands of people had lived there for 4 decades, they would have left something behind: tools, bones, pottery fragments, ash layers. Instead, there's nothing, just empty sand. Even the timeline doesn't make sense. Biblical chronology places the Exodus somewhere around the 13th century BCE during the reign of Ramses II, but Egyptian records from that period show no collapse, no mass escape of slaves, no disruption that matches the biblical account. In fact, the city of Pi-Ramesses, mentioned in the Bible as a place built by the Israelites, didn't even exist during the supposed lifetime of Moses. It was constructed centuries later. The story retrofits geography and history, placing details in the wrong centuries entirely. Some believers try to explain this away by saying the Egyptians wouldn't record their own embarrassment. But that argument falls apart quickly. Egyptians recorded defeats, invasions, and rebellions all the time, though often spun with royal propaganda. They didn't hide bad news, they reinterpreted it. If an entire slave population escaped after plagues and divine intervention, the Egyptians would have said their gods allowed it or blamed a rival deity. Silence makes no sense here, unless there was nothing to record. There's also a linguistic clue that shatters the story's timeline. The word Pharaoh used in the story of Moses wasn't even used as a title for Egyptian kings until much later. In the period where Moses supposedly lived, rulers were called by their names, not by the title Pharaoh. The use of that word betrays a later author, someone writing long after the events they claim to describe. It's like reading a medieval story about Julius Caesar using words like president or prime minister. It just doesn't fit. The deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes. The story of Moses wasn't written by eyewitnesses. It was written centuries later by people trying to create a collective memory, a unifying myth. Most biblical scholars today, even within religious circles, quietly admit this. The story was composed during or after the Babylonian exile, long after the events it pretends to record. It wasn't about chronicling history, it was about shaping identity. The Hebrews, exiled and scattered, needed a story to hold them together, so they created one about a hero who freed them from bondage, led them to a promised land, and gave them divine laws. As it was a psychological survival tool, a way of saying, we've endured worse, we'll endure again. The story of Moses wasn't about the past, it was about hope for the future, and that's where myth becomes powerful. Because myths don't need evidence, they need meaning. Moses gave meaning, he gave direction, he offered a symbol of liberation and divine purpose, but that doesn't make him real, it just makes him useful. The real history, as uncovered by archaeology, tells a different story entirely, one where the Israelites didn't come from Egypt at all. They emerged gradually from within Canaan itself, the very land they were supposedly sent to conquer. Excavations show no signs of foreign invaders suddenly appearing. Instead, they show a local population evolving culturally and religiously over time. In other words, the Israelites were native Canaanites who reinvented their past to make themselves distinct. That's the secret buried beneath the myth. Moses didn't lead a people out of Egypt. He was written into existence by a people already in Canaan, rewriting their origin story to justify their identity and beliefs. And once you see that, the entire narrative, from Burning Bush to Ten Commandments, starts to look like what it really is, a legend designed to anchor faith, not document history. If Moses never existed, then who wrote his story? And why was it written the way it was? That's where things get even more revealing. The story of Moses as we know it wasn't penned by one person or even one generation. It was compiled, edited, and reshaped by multiple authors across centuries. Most scholars refer to this as the documentary hypothesis, the idea that the Torah, including Exodus, is a collection of writings from different sources that were later stitched together. Each author group had its own agenda, its own perspective, and its own version of events. The J source, for example, uses the name Yahweh for God and presents a more anthropomorphic deity, one who walks, speaks, and even gets angry like a human. The E source prefers the name Elohim and has a slightly different tone. Then there's the P source, or priestly writer, who is obsessed with ritual, law, and hierarchy. And finally, the D source, responsible for Deuteronomy, emphasizes moral reform and centralized worship. Over time, these sources were woven together, creating contradictions and double versions of the same story, two creation accounts, two flood narratives, even two callings of Moses. What we read today is the edited result of centuries of storytelling and theological negotiation. That process helps explain why the story feels both grand and fragmented, part miracle, part memory, part myth. The story of Moses wasn't meant to record facts. It was meant to create identity and moral structure. The authors weren't historians. They were myth makers and nation builders. They took fragments of older Canaanite and Mesopotamian myths, merged them with political motives, and wrapped them in divine authority. For example, the Ten Commandments. They're often portrayed as the foundation of morality, timeless and universal. But the concept of divine law carved in stone predates the Bible by many centuries. The Code of Hammurabi, written in Babylon around 1750 BCE, already listed detailed moral and civil laws said to come from a god. The visual image of laws descending from the heavens wasn't new. It was symbolic propaganda. It gave divine legitimacy to social order. The authors of Exodus didn't invent that idea. They adapted it. And then there's the parting of the Red Sea, perhaps the most cinematic miracle in the Bible. It's been explained away in countless ways: tides, wind patterns, tsunamis. But the truth is, no historical or geological evidence backs any such event. The most plausible explanation is symbolic, a mythic retelling of liberation, using water as a metaphor for chaos and danger. Ancient Near Eastern literature is full of stories where the sea represents disorder, and divine figures part or defeat it. In that sense, the Exodus story echoes older myths, giving a familiar symbol a new twist. Even Moses' encounter with God on Mount Sinai has deep mythological roots. The image of a god revealing himself through fire and smoke atop a mountain is common throughout the region's religions. Mountains were seen as bridges between heaven and earth, natural places to locate divine revelation. What the story does uniquely is claim that only one God is real and he chose one people. That's not historical reporting, that's theological branding. And branding is exactly what religion needed to survive. The writers weren't just telling stories for entertainment, they were constructing a worldview, one that gave their people meaning, cohesion, and moral authority. To a people struggling with exile, defeat, and cultural identity, Moses became the perfect symbol: a liberator, a lawgiver, a leader who proved that even when empires enslave you, your God still sees you. It's a story that comforts, not records. Now, some might ask, even if Moses wasn't real, does it really matter? After all, myths can inspire, but it does matter, because myths mistaken for history shape real-world behavior. When people believe that their moral law comes from divine revelation rather than human reasoning, they stop questioning it. When nations believe their identity is chosen by a god, they justify conquest, exclusion, and intolerance. The story of Moses isn't just a harmless tale. It's a myth that has been used for thousands of years to legitimize authority and obedience. So that's the danger of unexamined stories. The Exodus narrative, for example, has been used to justify colonialism, nationalism, and even modern political movements. Everyone wants to be the chosen people, escaping oppression. Everyone wants to see their enemies as Pharaoh. But that oversimplified mythic thinking blinds us to the complexity of real human history. It divides the world into us and them and turns symbolic stories into political weapons. But if you strip away the myth, you find something even more profound: a human story underneath it all. A story of people struggling for meaning, trying to explain their suffering, trying to build hope out of chaos. The Israelites didn't invent Moses to deceive, they invented him to survive, to give their pain purpose, to imagine that somewhere beyond their suffering there was justice. That's not divine revelation, that's psychology. And when you see it that way, the story becomes even more fascinating. You start noticing that Moses is less a person and more a symbol, a composite of the collective human longing for liberation and moral clarity. Every culture has a version of him, a hero who brings truth from the gods, who challenges authority, who leads his people to freedom. Prometheus, Zoroaster, Gilgamesh, even the Buddha, all share elements of that archetype. Moses just happens to be the version that survived in Western consciousness. What this shows is that religion didn't begin with divine truth, it began with storytelling. Humans are storytelling animals. We turn chaos into narrative, randomness into purpose. When lightning strikes, we invent a god. When people suffer, we invent meaning. That's how myths like Moses are born. They're not evidence of divine action, they're evidence of human imagination. And this imagination is powerful. It can inspire art, unity, compassion, but it can also imprison us in illusion. Believing that Moses literally existed, that he spoke to a deity and split a sea, means accepting a worldview where authority comes from supernatural command, not human reason. It means surrendering critical thought to ancient stories written by people who didn't understand the world as we do now. But once you start asking questions, once you allow yourself to doubt, the spell breaks. You start seeing the patterns, the borrowed myths, the lack of evidence. You start realizing that history is not a divine script, but a human process. And suddenly, you don't need Moses to explain morality or meaning or freedom. You can see those things as products of human growth, empathy, and understanding. That realization doesn't take anything away. It gives something back. Ownership of your own morality, your own story, your own mind. You don't need a prophet carved from myth to tell you what's right. You can figure it out yourself. You can look at the evidence, follow reason, and find something truer than faith ever offered, a reality that doesn't need miracles to be awe-inspiring. And maybe that's the greatest liberation of all. When you realize how completely the Moses story unravels under scrutiny, it forces a bigger question. How much of what people call biblical history ever really happened at all? Once you see that the Exodus never took place, that Moses never existed, you start noticing a pattern. The earliest books of the Bible describe events that leave no trace in archaeology, no mention in surrounding cultures, and no credible connection to verifiable history. It's not that scholars haven't looked. They've been searching for centuries, but every time someone claims to find evidence of Moses, it collapses under examination. For example, the Ipuwer papyrus is often cited by apologists as proof of the biblical plagues. It's an Egyptian text describing chaos, rivers turning red, servants running away, the land in turmoil. It sounds tempting, almost like it matches the story. But scholars know the text dates to a completely different period, and it's written as poetic lamentation, not history. It was never describing an actual event. It was describing societal decay through symbolic imagery. The parallels are coincidence, not confirmation. The more people try to connect dots like these, the clearer it becomes that they're forcing history to fit a story, not the other way around. The same thing happens with claims of the Red Sea crossing or Mount Sinai. Over the years, countless discoveries have made headlines. Coral formations shaped like chariots, supposed remains of Egyptian soldiers, mysterious mountain peaks in Saudi Arabia, and every single one of them has turned out to be misinterpretation, pseudoscience, or outright fraud. When real archaeologists investigate, they find nothing, not a single trace of the Israelites' presence outside Canaan, nothing that even hints at a mass migration. The more rigor you bring to the search, the emptier it gets. But that emptiness is actually revealing. It tells us the story was never meant to be history. It was always metaphor. It's what happens when oral traditions evolve, when tribal memories, folk tales, and moral allegories get fused into a national epic. Myths serve as collective memory for people who had no written records. Over time, the myth becomes history, and people forget where the symbolism ends and literalism begins. There's another layer too. The political one, and the story of Moses became a convenient justification for power. It portrays divine authority as the ultimate source of law. Moses doesn't just lead, he dictates. His authority comes directly from God, and everyone else must obey. It's an ancient example of a recurring human pattern, legitimizing human authority by claiming divine endorsement. When you read the story that way, it's less about freedom and more about control. Think about it. The Israelites supposedly escaped the tyranny of Pharaoh only to end up under the commandments of another absolute ruler, God. They trade one form of obedience for another. The story preaches liberation but enforces conformity. The plagues and miracles distract from that deeper message that freedom, in the biblical sense, always comes with submission to divine authority. It's a theological sleight of hand. And once you recognize that, you see how powerful the myth has been. For thousands of years, it's been used to shape how people think about morality, law, and power. Kings, priests, and politicians have all pointed to Moses to justify their rule. claiming they too act on divine command. Even modern nations have borrowed the Exodus narrative to paint themselves as chosen liberators. The story became more than religion, it became political mythology. But at the heart of it, the Moses myth works because it taps into something universal, the human need to believe that someone somewhere knows the way. Life in the ancient world was chaotic, unpredictable, and harsh. People longed for guidance, for meaning, for a figure who could bridge the gap between humanity and the divine. Moses filled that void. He became the mediator, the man who could speak to God when no one else could. He represented certainty in a world full of fear. And even today, people crave that same certainty. That craving explains why so many resist the idea that Moses might not have existed. It's not just about archaeology, it's emotional. To accept that he was a myth means confronting a deeper insecurity, that maybe we've been building meaning on stories, not facts, that maybe the foundation of our moral and cultural identity rests on imagination, not revelation, and for many, that's too uncomfortable to face. So they protect the myth. They call doubt disrespect, and they call skepticism arrogance. But really, doubt is honesty. It's the courage to ask what's true even when the answers are inconvenient. And the truth is, myths evolve because they serve needs, not because they record events. Every generation reshapes Moses for its own purposes. In ancient times, he was the liberator from Egypt. In medieval times, he was the lawgiver and moral example. In modern times, he's become a symbol of resistance and leadership. But in every version, the man himself never changes because he never existed. He's a mirror, reflecting the hopes and fears of whoever tells his story. If we look at other mythological traditions, we see the same thing. Greek mythology had lawgivers like Minos, who claimed to receive his code directly from Zeus. In Persian tradition, Zarathustra received divine truth from Ahura Mazda. In India, Manu gave laws said to come from the gods. The pattern repeats because the psychology is the same. People want their morality to feel absolute. They don't want to admit it's a human construct. So they project it upward to the heavens and then pretend it came down carved in stone. And that's the genius of the Moses myth. It gives human rules divine weight. It makes obedience feel like virtue. It transforms social control into spiritual duty. That's why it lasted so long. Not because it was true, but because it was useful. The story gave people a sense of moral certainty that made societies easier to govern. When people believe their laws come from God, they don't question them. They don't rebel. They internalize obedience as faith. But that also explains why questioning the story is so threatening. Once you say Moses never existed, you're not just challenging a man. You're challenging the entire structure built around him. You're saying morality can exist without revelation. You're saying authority doesn't need divine approval. You're saying humans are capable of thinking for themselves. And that's the one thing religious power can't tolerate. The irony is that this kind of questioning is what truly frees people. When you stop taking myths as history, you can finally appreciate them as art, as human attempts to make sense of life. You can see the moral lessons without the dogma, the beauty without the fear. You can even admire the writers who, thousands of years ago, crafted such a powerful story. They weren't fools. They were early psychologists, understanding how to shape human behavior through narrative. They created a character who embodied leadership, morality, and awe. And in doing so, they created one of the most enduring figures in all of literature. But that's where he belongs, in literature, not history, not archaeology. In the realm of story, where he can be understood for what he really is, a symbol, not a man. And symbols don't need to be real to be powerful, but we do ourselves a disservice when we forget the difference. When you finally separate myth from reality, something amazing happens. You stop worshiping stories and you start learning from them. You stop waiting for a prophet and you start becoming responsible for your own understanding. The power that people once gave to Moses and the ability to question, to lead, to stand against authority, you realize that power was never divine. It was human all along. And maybe that's the truth the myth was trying to tell us all along. If you trace the origins of the Moses story far enough back, you start to see how the myth was shaped not by divine revelation, but by cultural evolution, by the blending of older legends, regional politics, and moral aspirations that were slowly assembled into one grand narrative. It didn't happen overnight. The Moses story was centuries in the making, and what's most striking is how every element of it has a human historical explanation, one that doesn't require a single miracle to make sense. Take the plagues of Egypt. They read like a dramatic confrontation between two gods, Yahweh versus the Egyptian pantheon, but when you step back, they look suspiciously like natural disasters exaggerated into theology. Nile floods turning red, that happens when certain algae bloom, tinting the water and suffocating fish. Frogs fleeing the poisoned river. Logical, insects multiplying after the frogs die off. Predictable. Disease, boils, hail, locusts, all known occurrences in the region. Ancient people didn't separate natural and supernatural causes the way we do today. They saw nature as a reflection of divine will. So when disaster struck, they told stories to explain it. And eventually, those stories were woven into a moral narrative. The suffering of Egypt as punishment, the liberation of the oppressed as divine justice. But the story didn't just borrow from natural phenomena, it also borrowed from politics. The Exodus narrative reflects real tensions between Egypt and its neighboring peoples. The Hebrews, if they existed as a distinct group at the time, might have been small Canaanite tribes living under Egyptian influence. Egypt controlled Canaan for centuries, and many Canaanites worked as laborers or indentured servants within the empire. At some point, small groups could have fled Egyptian rule seeking independence. Over time, their story of Afkinigi, or the idea of rebellion, might have evolved into a grand myth of mass liberation. As a tiny spark of truth expanded through generations of retelling until it became divine theater. This is how myths grow, and they start small in a memory, a rumor, a moral tale, and each generation adds layers until the story no longer resembles its origins. What began as a song about survival becomes a sacred text. And because these stories were transmitted orally for centuries before being written down, every storyteller changed something. They added, omitted, exaggerated. Myths don't survive by accuracy, they survive by emotional power. And few stories were more emotionally powerful than that of a people escaping tyranny with the help of a God who fought for them. But here's where things turn. Archaeology tells us that when the earliest Israelites appeared in the historical record, they were already living in Canaan. There's no trace of a sudden arrival from Egypt. Instead, the evidence shows gradual cultural differentiation. The same pottery styles, the same architecture, the same language, just with fewer pig bones in their settlements, suggesting new dietary restrictions. In other words, they weren't outsiders coming in. They were locals developing a unique identity and religious focus. The Exodus story was a retroactive creation, a national myth, explaining why they were chosen and different. It didn't record their origins, it invented them. And that invention had purpose. Every nation wants a story of deliverance, a defining myth that says, we came from struggle, we were guided by destiny. For the Israelites, Moses was the vessel for that identity. He turned abstract suffering into divine narrative. He gave meaning to displacement. He made their survival seem like fate. And once that story solidified, it became the moral backbone of their religion. It justified their laws, their rituals, their sense of uniqueness. Without Moses, the moral and theological structure of early Judaism would collapse. That's why the myth was preserved with such care, and why it couldn't be easily questioned. To doubt Moses was to doubt the entire foundation of law, justice, and community. He wasn't just a prophet. He was the symbol that made their worldview coherent, and that's what makes the story timeless. Because humans everywhere build their worlds the same way, we anchor our values in stories, then defend those stories as if they were facts. We prefer a beautiful lie to an uncomfortable truth because it feels safer, more meaningful, more stable, but that's also how delusion begins. When the story becomes more sacred than the search for truth, And the search for truth tells a very different story. It shows that morality didn't need to be handed down on tablets, it evolved. Societies discovered fairness and cooperation through lived experience. Thou shalt not kill isn't divine wisdom, it's common sense for anyone who wants their community to survive. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness. These aren't commandments from heaven. They're the product of human empathy and necessity. The fact that so many cultures develop the same moral principles independently proves it. These ideas didn't need Moses' youth as they needed humanity. That's what makes the myth of Moses so fascinating. It's a reflection of human moral evolution disguised as divine revelation. The story gives credit to a God for what humans achieved on their own. It's as if ancient people, unable to imagine morality without authority, invented the ultimate authority figure, a divine lawgiver, to make their moral instincts feel absolute. And that instinct, though understandable, became a trap. Because once people believed morality came from above, they stopped trusting their own reason to question it. And questioning is exactly what the Moses story discourages. Think about it. The entire narrative is about obedience. When Moses questions God, he's rebuked. When the people doubt, they're punished. And when they disobey, they suffer. It's a story that rewards submission and punishes curiosity. The same psychological pattern runs through almost every religious myth. Control through divine fear. And it's brilliant because it works. People obey when they believe the authority isn't human. They stop asking why. But in doing that, they also stop growing. The Moses story may have once united tribes, but today it keeps minds tethered to the past. It teaches people to see obedience as virtue and independent thought as rebellion. And yet, ironically, the very story that demands obedience is built on a lie so old and so deeply woven into culture that most never question it. A lie that says our morality, our meaning, our worth must come from outside ourselves. When you realize that Moses never existed, it's not just a historical discovery, it's a philosophical awakening. It means we can reclaim morality as a human achievement. It means we can see that compassion, justice, and freedom don't need divine permission. They come from us and from reason, from empathy, from shared experience. And that realization doesn't destroy meaning, it deepens it, because when you understand that humans invented morality, you also understand that we can improve it. We can adapt it as we learn, as we evolve, as we grow. And that's something no ancient story could ever offer, the ability to progress. The story of Moses froze morality in time, carved it into stone, made it static, but life moves, societies change, knowledge grows. If we cling to myths as unchangeable truth, we end up worshiping the past instead of learning from it. That's why breaking free from these stories isn't an act of rebellion. When it's an act of maturity, it's taking responsibility for our own minds, our own ethics, our own future. The irony is that if Moses were real, if he truly stood for liberation and wisdom, he'd probably agree with that idea. He'd tell us to stop following blindly, to seek truth for ourselves, to question authority. And that's the paradox of myth. Sometimes the lesson hidden inside the lie is the one that leads you to freedom. And once you see that, you don't need prophets anymore. You just need honesty. Once you start viewing the Moses story through the lens of history, archaeology, and psychology rather than faith, something fascinating happens. The myth begins to reveal what it was really trying to do. It wasn't written to deceive, it was written to unify. It wasn't about recording facts, it was about creating meaning. The people who shaped the story weren't historians, they were survivors. They were trying to make sense of defeat, exile, and suffering in a world that offered no easy answers. The figure of Moses was their way of saying, Kruitor, we are not forgotten, we have purpose, we are guided. In that sense, he was less a man and more a mirror, reflecting their deepest fears and hopes. But the irony is that the myth that once gave strength eventually became a cage. Over time, what started as metaphor hardened into dogma. The story that once inspired freedom became a rule book for control. Instead of encouraging people to think, it demanded they believe. Instead of helping them grow, It taught them to obey. That's the danger of taking symbolic truths literally. They turned flexible wisdom into fixed ideology. And that's exactly what happened with Moses. The myth was never meant to be history, but once people started treating it as history, it began shaping real laws, real behavior, real wars. If you look closely, you can see how much of Western civilization was built on that illusion. The Ten Commandments became the moral foundation for entire legal systems. The Exodus became a metaphor for national destiny, for chosen people, promised lands, divine missions. It gave rulers divine justification and ordinary people divine comfort. But beneath all that grandeur was just a story, one born from ancient fears, hopes, and political needs. Archaeology makes this even clearer. The earliest Hebrew writings, the kind scratched into pottery shards or carved into stone, show a gradual transition from polytheism to monotheism. Early Israelites worshiped many gods, not one. Yahweh was originally just one deity among others in the Canaanite pantheon, a storm god, a regional protector. Over time, as power structures changed, Yahweh was elevated and all others were demoted or erased. That process, turning a local deity into the one true God, took centuries. The story of Moses played a central role in cementing that shift. It gave the theological revolution a backstory, a divine revelation from the beginning of time. But the evidence shows the opposite. Belief in one God didn't start with Moses. Moses was invented to justify belief in one God. Even the concept of chosen people reflects that political evolution. When ancient tribes tried to unify under one faith, they needed a shared sense of destiny. They needed a story that said, we're special. Our God loves us more than anyone else's. The Exodus provided that identity, persecution, deliverance, and divine favor all rolled into one. It's an emotionally powerful formula, and it's been reused endlessly ever since. Every nation, every movement that wants to see itself as righteous eventually borrows it. The problem is that kind of story breeds superiority. It divides the world into chosen and unchosen, blessed and cursed. It's comforting for one group, but dangerous for everyone else. That's why the Moses myth, for all its poetry, also carries a darker legacy. It's been used to justify conquest, colonialism, and control, always in the name of divine will. From the Crusades to modern nationalism, the same pattern repeats. People claim to be liberated by their God while oppressing others. In his name, the irony is brutal. The story that was supposed to symbolize freedom has been used to rationalize domination. That's the risk when myths are mistaken for mandates. And yet, even knowing all that, the story still fascinates. Because underneath the superstition and symbolism, there's something deeply human in it. It's the story of people longing for justice, searching for meaning in suffering, trying to find direction in chaos. It's what makes mythology so enduring. Myths survive because they speak to emotional truths even when they distort factual ones. The story of Moses resonates because it's about liberation, courage, and transformation, themes that are universal. You don't need to believe it literally to understand why it matters. You just need to see it as what it really is, a piece of human art, not divine revelation. And when you see it that way, the story becomes even more powerful because it stops being about one man's miracles and starts being about everyone's potential. You don't need a burning bush to find purpose. You don't need commandments written in stone to know right from wrong. You don't need an ancient prophet to tell you how to live. Those answers have always been within us. And the story of Moses was never proof of divine authority. It was evidence of human creativity, our ability to turn confusion into meaning. When you realize that, you start reading the Bible differently. You stop asking, did this really happen? And start asking, what were they trying to say? You see the moral allegories instead of the miracles, the human psychology instead of divine intervention. You see fear, hope, pride, guilt, all the ingredients of human storytelling projected into the heavens. You see people trying to make sense of life without science, without philosophy, without history. And when you see that clearly, it becomes impossible to take it literally anymore. The truth is, every civilization creates its own version of Moses, a figure who defines the rules, who guides, who gives legitimacy. Even modern societies have their secular prophets, people who shape moral direction, who inspire movements, who turn abstract values into collective purpose. The difference is, we don't need to call them divine. We can admire them as human, flawed, evolving, temporary, just like us. That's what makes progress possible. Understanding that greatness doesn't come from gods, but from people who dare to think differently. And that's exactly what happens when you let go of the myth. When you stop needing Moses to be real, you can finally see what's real in the story. The courage to question authority, the strength to walk away from comfort and conformity, the desire to build a better world, even when it means leaving behind the one you know. Those are not divine traits, they're human ones. They belong to anyone brave enough to seek truth over tradition. That's why saying Moses never existed isn't an act of destruction, it's an act of honesty. It's peeling back layers of tradition to find what's actually worth keeping. It's freeing the story from dogma so it can breathe again as art, psychology, and philosophy. Once you do that, you realize you don't need to defend the story to appreciate it. You don't need to believe it literally to find beauty in it. You just need to see it clearly as a mirror of us. And maybe that's the ultimate proof that Moses never existed, but also never really died. Because every time someone stands up to power, every time someone seeks truth in the face of dogma, every time someone walks away from comfortable lies, they become a little bit like the Moses that never was. The story may not be real, but its lesson that liberation begins in the mind absolutely is. And that's something no tablet, no miracle, no ancient myth can ever erase. The strange thing about myths is that once they take hold, they become harder to kill than truth itself. The story of Moses has survived empires, translations, reformations, and revolutions. It's been retold in temples, churches, and classrooms for over 2,000 years. And despite every archaeological failure, every historical contradiction, and every scholarly dismantling, people still hold on to it. That's not because it's true, it's because it's useful. Myths survive not because they describe reality, but because they serve psychological and social needs that reality can't always meet. Humans need order. We need narratives that tell us who we are and why we matter. A purely factual world and one without grand purpose can feel cold, even frightening. The Moses story fills that void perfectly. It gives chaos meaning, injustice structure, and suffering purpose. It turns randomness into design. It says there's a plan, there's a law, there's a leader chosen by something higher than us. That's comforting. That's why people defend the myth even when they know deep down that it doesn't add up. But comfort isn't the same as truth. And history, if it's honest, forces us to choose between the two. Every time archaeologists dig deeper into the Bronze Age layers of Egypt and Canaan, they find more reasons to doubt, not fewer. The timelines don't match. The artifacts don't align. The culture described in Exodus simply doesn't exist in the archaeological record. The Israelites, when they first appear in the record around 1200 BCE, are already settled in the hill country of Canaan, not wandering refugees, not former slaves. They were farmers, herders, locals. The story of mass exodus doesn't explain their origin. It contradicts it. The silence of Egyptian records, the absence of migration trails, the anachronisms in language and geography, all of it points to one unavoidable conclusion. Moses is a literary construction, a character built from fragments of older myths, recycled cultural memories, and moral ideals. He's part Sargon of Akkad, part Hammurabi, part local folklore, wrapped in theological narrative. In that sense, he's not a person. He's an anthology of human imagination. Even the way the Moses story was edited tells you something. In the ancient world, scribes were not passive recorders. They were interpreters, editors, propagandists. They wrote for kings and priests, not for posterity. When they shaped the story of Moses, they weren't asking what really happened. They were asking, what does our people need to believe right now? And the answer at that time was hope. They needed to believe that oppression had meaning, that exile was temporary, that the chaos of the world could be tamed by divine law. So they wrote a story where all those things were true, and it worked. The myth of Moses became a cultural engine, one that powered centuries of endurance and cohesion. Even after the exile ended, the story remained the backbone of identity. When Christianity arose, it absorbed Moses into its own theology, turning him into a forerunner of Christ. When Islam emerged, it adopted him again, this time as a prophet of submission and divine justice. Every religion that borrowed Moses reshaped him, repurposed him, and reimagined him to fit its agenda. Yet through all of it, the one thing that never changed was his usefulness. He was endlessly adaptable because he was never real to begin with. If he had been real, a single historical man, he would have been fixed in one time and place, but because he was myth, he could be reborn endlessly. That's the paradox. Fiction lasts longer than fact. Real people die, myths evolve, and that's exactly why Moses endures. He's not a man frozen in history, he's a symbol floating above it, a symbol of moral authority, divine purpose, liberation, law, leadership, all the things humans crave when the world feels uncertain. But once you see that clearly, you also see the danger in it, because when authority becomes mythological, it becomes unquestionable. The name Moses has been used for centuries to silence doubt, to justify hierarchy, to claim divine approval for human power. Kings invoked him, priests hid behind him, and believers used him to validate their own certainties. The story that once symbolized escape from tyranny became a tool of tyranny itself, and all because people confused metaphor with fact. That's why the question, did Moses exist, isn't just academic. It matters deeply because how we answer it shapes how we think about authority, morality, and truth. If we keep pretending that morality needs divine approval, we'll never fully own it. If we keep teaching myths as facts, we teach generations to value belief over evidence, obedience over understanding. And when that happens, history repeats itself. People follow the next self-proclaimed Moses, whoever he happens to be, right off the cliff. But there's another way to read the story, one that doesn't demand belief, only understanding. You can look at Moses not as a prophet, but as an early symbol of humanity's growing awareness of conscience, the burning bush, the commandments, the liberation, where there are metaphors for awakening, for learning to question authority, to challenge injustice, to build moral systems from human experience. Seen that way, the myth isn't harmful at all. It's a poetic way of describing something very real, the evolution of human ethics. That's why myths don't need to be destroyed. They need to be reinterpreted. They only become dangerous when they're mistaken for literal truth. Whereas if people could see Moses as a story about moral progress rather than divine law, it could still inspire without deceiving. The difference between wisdom and dogma is understanding that stories are tools, not truths. Once you grasp that, you can appreciate their beauty without being bound by their claims. And that's where the liberation really lies. Not in crossing a sea, not in following a prophet, but in realizing that truth doesn't need to come from authority at all. It can come from observation, from reason, from empathy, from the quiet courage to say, I don't know, but I want to find out. That's what separates myth from enlightenment. Myths demand belief. Truth invites curiosity. Moses told people to obey. Reality asks us to explore. And maybe that's the real parting of the sea, not waves of water, but waves of ignorance dividing people from understanding. Once you see through the myth, the water's calm. You realize you never needed anyone to lead you to the other side. You were always capable of walking there yourself. When you reach that point, when the illusion finally cracks, it's not bitterness that follows, but clarity. You start to see how the story of Moses has always been less about history and more about human nature. It's a reflection of what we crave, certainty, leadership, and moral order in a chaotic world. The story satisfies emotional needs that logic alone can't touch. But once you understand that, you no longer need to confuse emotional comfort with historical truth. And that's the beginning of intellectual freedom, when you stop needing stories to be real in order to find them meaningful. You can respect the myth as a cultural creation without kneeling before it as divine revelation. You can recognize that its authors weren't recording God's words. They were recording humanity's struggle to understand existence. The tablets, the burning bush, the plagues, Those are metaphors for insight, awakening, and transformation. They were never meant to be literal events in time. They were lessons told through symbols. What's fascinating is that ancient people often understood this better than modern believers do. In many early societies, myths were openly recognized as allegory. They weren't lies, they were teaching tools. It was only later, as religious institutions grew, that myths hardened into facts. Priests and rulers learned that literal belief was a far stronger tool of control than symbolic understanding. If people believed the stories were literally true, they were easier to manage. Questioning a metaphor is harmless, but questioning a fact is heresy. And so, mythology became dogma, poetry became law, and the search for meaning was replaced by the demand for obedience. Moses' story became the perfect vessel for that transformation. It fused divine law with political power. The commandments weren't just moral guidance, they were presented as unchangeable truth. Written by the hand of God, chose no discussion, no evolution. That's how control hides behind faith, by pretending morality is finished, perfect, and beyond question. But real morality is never finished. It's a living thing. It grows with understanding. It adapts with empathy. It changes as we learn more about ourselves and each other. That's why the story of Moses, when taken literally, traps people in the past. It suggests that perfection already happened and that truth was already delivered, that there's nothing left to discover, but that's not how knowledge works. Truth isn't a revelation, it's a process. It's something we build, revise, and refine. Science works that way. Philosophy works that way. Even personal growth works that way. Yet religion, tied to its ancient myths, tries to freeze morality in time. It worships words instead of wisdom, and the cost of that has been enormous. How many centuries have people spent fighting, judging, and dividing over interpretations of laws that were never divine in the first place? How many lives were shaped or destroyed because of a myth mistaken for fact? How many people were told that doubt, the very thing that leads to understanding, was a sin? That's what blind belief does. It sanctifies ignorance. It teaches people that certainty is holier than truth. But if you look closely, even the story itself gives away the truth it tries to hide. The moment Moses breaks the tablets, furious at his people, that's not just a scene of divine anger. It's a symbol of moral failure. It's the admission that laws written in stone will always break against the complexity of human life. Morality can't survive if it's rigid. It needs context, compassion, and reason. Even within the myth, the story hints at what its literal believers refuse to see, that wisdom doesn't come from commandments, it comes from understanding. Once you step back from the illusion, you start to see the larger pattern of human myth-making. Every culture invents its own Moses, someone to deliver the law, to define right and wrong, to claim authority on behalf of something higher. The Greeks had Minos, the Persians had Zoroaster, the Babylonians had Hammurabi, the Hindus had Manu. All of them were lawgivers, chosen by gods, bringing order to chaos. And none of them were literal prophets. They were personifications of law itself. They made morality tangible by giving it a human face. Moses is just the Hebrew version of that universal archetype. This doesn't make the story meaningless, it makes it deeply human, because it shows that people everywhere were trying to solve the same problem. How do we live together? How do we build trust? How do we keep our society from falling apart? The divine origin of law wasn't the answer. It was the expression of fear. People didn't trust themselves to make moral decisions, so they outsourced them to heaven. They made morality sacred because they didn't yet know how to make it rational. And in a way, that's understandable. Ancient people lived in a world they couldn't explain. Disease, drought, death, everything was mysterious. Their myths were attempts to impose order. But we don't live in that world anymore. We have tools, knowledge, and understanding that they couldn't even imagine. Yet, so many still cling to their stories as if they were the only foundation of meaning. That's not reverence, it's fear of growth. And that fear is then unnecessary, because once you realize that morality doesn't need to be divine to be real, You stop fearing the loss of faith. You see that meaning doesn't disappear when myths fall apart. It expands. You can build ethics on empathy, purpose on evidence, wonder on understanding. You don't need an ancient text to tell you that cruelty is wrong or that kindness matters. You already know that. It's written in experience, not stone. The story of Moses then isn't just about religion, it's about the evolution of human consciousness. It's a snapshot of the moment when humanity began to take responsibility for its own behavior, but still disguise that responsibility as divine command. It's a bridge between superstition and moral awakening. It's the halfway point between fear and freedom. And when you see it that way, the phrase Moses never existed becomes less an accusation and more a realization that what we've been calling revelation was really reflection. A reflection of humanity learning to define right and wrong, still afraid to admit it was doing so on its own. The burning bush was never about a God speaking. It was about people beginning to listen to their own conscience. That's the part of the story worth keeping. Not the miracles, not the mythology, but the moment of awakening hidden underneath. The realization that morality, wisdom, and courage come from within. That's what Moses symbolizes, even if he never lived. And in a strange way, that makes him more meaningful than if he had, because when the myth falls, what remains is the truth that created it, us. There's something profoundly liberating about recognizing that the stories we were told as children don't have to be literal to hold meaning. When you stop insisting that Moses must have lived, that every miracle must have happened exactly as written, you begin to see something far more impressive. How capable humans are of creating stories powerful enough to last thousands of years. That's not divine proof, that's human brilliance. The story endures not because it's true, but because it's deeply resonant. It speaks to fears, hopes, and questions that still live in us. But here's where honesty matters. If we don't separate myth from history, we lose our grip on reality. We start shaping our world around things that never happened, building institutions on stories that collapse under evidence. And that's not harmless. It shapes how societies behave. When people believe that a divine lawgiver once dictated morality, they stop seeing morality as a work in progress. They treat it as finished, frozen, untouchable. They resist change even when reason demands it. That's how good intentions become moral stagnation. And you can see this pattern repeat again and again throughout history. Every time humanity tries to evolve morally, religion digs in its heels, not because faith is inherently evil, but because its foundations are built on the idea that truth already arrived once, long ago, through figures like Moses, but truth doesn't arrive. It unfolds slowly, painfully, through questioning, testing, revising. The real miracle isn't revelation, it's curiosity. When you look at the archaeological record, it tells a story that's far more consistent, far more human, and far more beautiful than the one in Exodus. Instead of a nation guided by divine power, you find small, struggling communities carving out an existence in harsh terrain. They built homes, farms, and villages. They worshiped many gods at first, then fewer, then one. They developed laws, not because a prophet handed them down, but because people learned that cooperation works better than chaos. Piece by piece, they built civilization as not from miracles, but from experience. That's the real story of Israel's birth. No sea splitting, no tablets from heaven, just people trying to survive, adapt, and find meaning. And in a way, that's far more inspiring because it means progress isn't something we wait for. It's something we make. It means liberation doesn't come from the sky. It comes from understanding. It means morality doesn't descend from mountains. It rises from empathy. The truth is humbler than the myth, but also more empowering. It tells us that we are not the servants of ancient stories. We are their authors. That realization changes everything. It takes morality out of the clouds and puts it back where it belongs, in our hands. It makes ethics flexible, dynamic, capable of growth. When morality is divine, it's static. When it's human, it can evolve. And the proof of that evolution is everywhere. Slavery was once seen as natural, now it's abhorred. Women were once property, now they fight for equality. These shifts didn't happen because of divine law. They happened because people dared to question divine law. Every moral breakthrough in history came from challenging, not obeying the supposed words of gods. And yet, even as progress advances, the myth of Moses lingers. It's still invoked as a symbol of moral authority, of leadership, of liberation, and that's fine, as long as we understand what it really is: a story, a human story, a poetic reflection of our own growth, not proof of divine control. It's when we forget that distinction that trouble begins. When we confuse inspiration with instruction, myth with mandate, we turn creativity into confinement. The real tragedy isn't that people once believed in Moses, it's that many still think they need him, that without divine authority, morality collapses, that without commandments, chaos reigns. But that fear underestimates humanity. Most people live decently not because of religion, but because empathy and reason make it the better choice. You don't need a burning bush to know cruelty is wrong. You just need to feel and think. The Moses myth was created in an age when people didn't yet trust those inner capacities. They needed external authority. They needed the illusion of divine command to make morality feel real. But that illusion isn't necessary anymore. Humanity has outgrown it. We know enough about psychology, ethics, and society to understand where morality actually comes from: cooperation, empathy, shared survival. As we can see why compassion works, why fairness matters, why honesty builds stronger communities. None of that requires a prophet. It just requires awareness. And that awareness changes how you see everything. Once you realize that Moses was a story, not a man, religion stops looking like a source of truth and starts looking like a record of human evolution, a long, messy, creative process of figuring out who we are and how to live together. The myth of Moses isn't evidence of God. It's evidence of us, of our imagination, our fear of chaos, our longing for purpose. And maybe in that sense, it's more sacred than any literal truth could be, because it shows how desperately we've always wanted to be better. The tragedy is that we built temples around the symbol instead of seeing what it symbolized. We turned the mirror into a mask. We bowed to the story instead of learning from it. We mistook metaphor for commandment. And that confusion still echoes today in politics and morality, in how people treat anyone who dares to question. We still act as if truth is blasphemy and doubt is betrayal, but doubt is the only way truth survives. If there's one lesson worth keeping from the Moses myth, it's that liberation starts with a question: why should I obey? What if they're wrong? What if the truth is different from what I've been told? Those questions are the real burning bush, the spark that ignites every leap in human understanding. The moment you ask them, you step out of bondage, not physical bondage, but intellectual and moral bondage, the kind that chains people to unquestioned ideas. That's what the story was trying to tell us all along, even if its authors didn't realize it. The Exodus wasn't about crossing a desert. It was about crossing a threshold from dependence to autonomy, from fear to understanding, from myth to meaning. The people may have followed a prophet in the story, but the lesson is that you don't need one in real life. The journey is yours to take. And that's the beautiful irony. Once you accept that Moses never existed, you finally understand the part of him that does. The courage to question, the strength to stand apart, the voice that says, there's more beyond this, and you don't need miracles for that. You just need honesty and a willingness to face truth without fear, because that's where real liberation begins. And it never needed a prophet to start it. The most difficult part of letting go of the Moses story isn't intellectual, it's emotional. It's not about the evidence, because the evidence is already clear. It's about what that evidence means for everything built on top of the myth. If Moses never existed, then the foundation of three major religions becomes symbolic rather than historical. The Exodus, the Ten Commandments, the revelation at Sinai, they're not divine moments frozen in time. They're literary metaphors, cultural myths woven together over centuries. And that realization can feel destabilizing. People fear that if the story collapses, morality collapses with it, but it doesn't. It never does, because morality never came from Moses. It never came from any prophet. It came from people living together, figuring out what works. It came from trial and error, from pain and compassion, from the need to cooperate. The idea that moral understanding depends on divine revelation is one of humanity's oldest misunderstandings. If you look at any moral teaching attributed to Moses, don't kill, don't steal, don't lie. They existed in other cultures long before. They weren't divine laws, they were human survival strategies. Religion simply gave them a divine signature so people would take them seriously. Once you see that, the fear of losing morality fades. You realize we've been moral all along, long before tablets and commandments. You realize that the real power lies not in obedience, but in awareness. When you act kindly, it's not because of fear of punishment or promise of reward. It's because you understand the value of empathy, the logic of fairness, the worth of another person's happiness. That's morality rooted in reason, not revelation. And it's far more stable because it doesn't rely on faith, it relies on understanding. The irony is that the very scholars who study the Bible from within religious traditions often know this better than the faithful who read it literally. Many theologians quietly acknowledge that Moses is a mythic figure. They know the archaeological silence, the textual inconsistencies, the anachronisms. They know the story was written centuries after the events it describes, during times of political reconstruction and identity crisis, yet the institutions they serve depend on the story being treated as sacred history, so they keep the truth buried beneath the language of faith. It's not deception so much as self-preservation, a reluctance to admit that their foundations are metaphor, not fact. But a foundation built on metaphor can still hold meaning, as long as we stop pretending it's stone. Myths, when understood as myths, are not lies. They're expressions of human truth. They tell us how people once made sense of the world. They show us our ancestors' fears, hopes, and attempts to find order in chaos. That's valuable. That's worth studying, celebrating even. The problem arises when we mistake symbolic wisdom for literal history. Then the myth becomes dogma, and dogma becomes division. And that division has shaped human history in ways we still live with. The Moses story, when taken literally, gave birth to an idea that one group is chosen, that one law is absolute, that one truth is final. It turned moral curiosity into moral certainty. And certainty, not evil, not malice, but certainty, is what has driven so much conflict in the name of God. When people stop questioning because they believe they already have divine truth, reason dies quietly in the background. The myth becomes a boundary that separates rather than a mirror that reflects. That's why questioning isn't dangerous, it's necessary. It's what keeps morality alive. When you start asking, what if this never happened? You're not tearing down meaning, you're rebuilding it on firmer ground. You're replacing inherited stories with examined truths. You're saying, I want to understand, not just believe. That's how humanity evolves. Every breakthrough, moral or scientific, began with someone daring to ask the forbidden question. And that's what makes the Moses myth strangely poetic. For all its insistence on obedience, its central figure is a questioner. Moses argues with God, demands proof, asks why. The very qualities that the story suppresses are the ones it secretly celebrates. That's what makes mythology so revealing. It often contains the seeds of its own undoing. The same story used to enforce belief also teaches the value of doubt. If you read carefully, even the Bible can't hide the human hunger for truth behind its divine curtain. So when you strip the story down to its core, you find something timeless. The human desire to make meaning out of suffering. The Hebrews in exile, the priests in Babylon, the storytellers trying to rebuild identity. They weren't writing history. They were writing healing. They were saying, we suffered, but it must mean something. And that's not deception, and it's resilience. They built a narrative strong enough to hold a people together, and that's something to respect, even if the details aren't true. But we don't live in exile anymore. We don't need to cling to myth for survival. We can face reality without divine reassurance. We can find purpose without holy law. We can build ethics without fear of punishment. That's what progress is. Outgrowing the need for stories that once kept us safe. The truth doesn't make life meaningless. It makes it honest. It opens the door to growth, to self-responsibility, to moral independence. When you understand that Moses never existed, you don't lose the moral world he supposedly built. You gain ownership of it. You inherit the responsibility to keep improving it, to ask better questions, to expand compassion beyond tribal lines, to evolve the laws that once claimed to be perfect. You stop waiting for prophets and start becoming the author of your own moral code. That's not heresy. That's maturity. The myth of Moses, stripped of its supernatural dressing, becomes a mirror for that process. It reminds us that every civilization must eventually let go of its gods and take responsibility for its own wisdom. That's the real exodus and the journey from faith to understanding, from obedience to autonomy, from illusion to truth. It's not an easy journey, but it's the only one that leads to freedom. And maybe that's the most fitting conclusion to the story that never happened. Moses didn't lead anyone across the sea, but the story of Moses, when read honestly, can still lead us somewhere, out of blindness, out of fear, out of inherited belief, into a world where truth doesn't need to be divine to be powerful, into a world where meaning isn't handed down, it's created. And in that sense, the myth fulfilled its purpose. It led us here to the edge of reason and the choice to cross it ourselves. The story of Moses has always been about journeys, leaving, crossing, seeking something better on the other side. That's why it endures. Even after we strip away the miracles, the plagues, and the divine voice, the essence of the story still speaks to something universal, the need to move beyond what confines us. The tragedy is that religion froze that metaphor into dogma. What was meant to be a story about liberation became a system of control. What was meant to symbolize courage became a command to conform. And that's why revisiting the myth matters, not to mock it, but to reclaim what it was really about. Because the real Exodus isn't out of Egypt, it's out of ignorance, out of dependency, out of the need to be told what to think. The moment you realize that Moses never existed, you step out of the mental Egypt that kept people bound to myth. You see that the sea wasn't a barrier between slaves and freedom. It was the divide between belief and understanding. And the crossing wasn't a miracle. It was a choice. Every person who chooses truth over tradition walks that same path. The irony is that this realization doesn't destroy the moral message of the story, it strengthens it. Because if Moses never existed, then the values people once credited to him, justice, compassion, perseverance, become even more impressive. They weren't given by a God, they were discovered by us. Humanity, through reflection and struggle, learned those lessons the hard way. The laws we call divine were born from human experience, written in blood and history, not on stone tablets. And that's what makes them meaningful. They weren't gifts, they were achievements. And when you see morality that way, it stops feeling like obligation and starts feeling like responsibility. You're not obeying rules out of fear of punishment. You're upholding values because you understand their worth. That's the difference between moral maturity and moral dependence. One needs prophets, the other doesn't. One needs miracles, the other trusts reason. One looks to the sky, the other looks inward. And the more you look inward, the clearer the truth becomes. The burning bush was never out there. It was always within. That's what makes myth so paradoxical. Even when it's false, it points toward truth. The story of Moses was never about proving divine existence. It was about the human longing to find meaning and freedom. And that's still relevant today. We still struggle with the same questions: how to live with integrity, how to balance justice and mercy, how to find purpose without illusion. The ancient writers used gods to frame those questions, but the questions themselves are timeless. We don't need the mythology anymore, but we still need the wisdom buried inside it. It's strange, isn't it? Once you stop treating the Bible as history, it becomes philosophy. Once you stop defending it as literal truth, you can finally listen to what it's actually saying. It stops being a rule book and becomes a mirror, one that shows how humanity has been wrestling with the same moral and existential problems for thousands of years. The stories become our history, not of events, but of consciousness. They trace our evolution from fear to faith, from faith to reason, and hopefully from reason to understanding. And in that sense, the death of the literal Moses marks the birth of something far more powerful: self-awareness. It's the moment we stop projecting authority onto the heavens and start recognizing it in ourselves. the mountain, the tablets, the commandments. They were never about divine descent. They were about ascent, about in climbing toward knowledge, shaping our own laws, and realizing that morality isn't handed down. It's built up, slowly, imperfectly, courageously. That's what the story really is. A map of human development disguised as divine intervention. And like all maps, it points somewhere real, even if its symbols are imaginary. The problem is when people mistake the map for the destination. They stop walking, they stop thinking, they build temples around the signposts and call them truth. And that's what keeps humanity circling the same desert, worshiping old symbols instead of continuing the journey those symbols were meant to inspire. Breaking free from that cycle doesn't mean erasing the past. It means understanding it. It means seeing religion as a chapter in the story of human growth, not the end of it. The story of Moses was a step in that evolution, a powerful one, but it's not the final word. The real promised land isn't a place. It's a mindset, one where truth isn't feared, where doubt isn't punished, where understanding isn't blasphemy. That's the destination that the myth accidentally pointed toward. And that's why exposing Moses as a myth isn't an act of destruction. It's an act of completion. It closes the circle. It returns the story to its rightful place as a metaphor for human progress. It allows us to take ownership of the wisdom it tried to externalize. It reminds us that everything we once attributed to gods was always a reflection of us. Our fears, our hopes, our imagination. We were never following divine voices. We were listening to ourselves through stories we didn't yet know we were writing. That realization doesn't make life emptier. It makes it fuller, because it means meaning is not something we inherit. It's something we create. Every generation, every person gets to write their own tablets, to define their own commandments, not from superstition, but from compassion and logic. That's the real revelation. That's the fire on the mountain that never goes out, the spark of consciousness that keeps us evolving. So yes, Moses never existed. There's no archaeology, no inscription, no trace of his life. But the story of Moses, the idea of seeking, questioning, freeing, that's very real. It's the story of us. And it's still unfolding, still being written, not in sacred texts, but in the choices we make, the truths we face, and the courage we show when we walk away from comforting lies. We don't need miracles to make that journey. We just need honesty. We don't need prophets to guide us. We just need curiosity. And we don't need commandments carved in stone. We just need the will to keep questioning and the humility to know that truth isn't something we receive. It's something we earn. That's the lesson buried beneath the myth. The one that no religion can claim ownership of, the one that belongs to all of us. The story ends not at a mountain, not at a sea, not in a promised land, but right here, with us realizing that we were never the followers in the story, we were the authors all along. And maybe in the end, that's the proof we were always looking for.